Okay, I'd love to welcome our next speaker. Our next speaker is Zechariah Reuelu, and he is a serial entrepreneur. He is passionate about protecting and promoting the Tokelauan culture in communities, and particularly passionate about using Indigenous knowledge and practice to complement and accelerate educational achievements. So, hi Zechariah, welcome.
Malodi, thank you.
Malolo. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming today. And I'd love to be able to talk with you. You've got so much knowledge and experience of working with the communities and working alongside the education system. And so I'm really looking forward to being able to have lots of conversation with you today about that. The first question I've got for you is, what do you see are the challenges in the education system?
My parents migrated from, my mother from Samoa and my father from a small atoll, which is part of New Zealand's territory, the Tokelauan Islands. So they migrated here in the late 50s, early 60s, and met here as single people and establish a family where 6 of my siblings are part of that. I'm part of 6 siblings. And so I went to kindergarten in the late 60s. And then early 70s, I transitioned into primary school. And from there, I went to intermediate, Brandon Intermediate in Aotearoa, and finished my college years at Aotearoa College. And so living and being born in New Zealand, I've gone through a New Zealand schooling system that are all in stages of life for that child. I can't recall until I got to intermediate where I first saw a non-European staff, Māori staff, and a Cook Highland teacher at intermediate. And then I saw a small number more at Aotearoa College. So going through those stages, I thought was normal. For a very long time in my thought process. It wasn't until I started a young family with my wife. We have 3 children, and I have an older son. And so it was through those 3 of my child and my wife, the oldest 12 years old at the moment, that I began to sense how separated the stage of life for Pacific embedded in the education system here in New Zealand. While I acknowledge that there's been a lot of work on a number of government policies over the years to improve Māori and Pacific achievement, what I've seen is in New Zealand education system from under 5, primary, intermediate, college, and higher education, they all have a Pacific plan. And in our Indigenous or Tokelauan culture, we only have one plan. And that one plan is the Tokelauan intergeneration well-being plan. It is not written. It is a living organ, agile, of taking a born child and caring for that child and their family while they go through stages of life, that we still look after them when they are elderly and vulnerable. And so in our culture, there's no separation in that life cycle journey. Yet in the education system, those separate sectors are facing the same challenges. For example, lack of parents' participation in primary, lack of parents' involvement in college. So the problems are quite universal across. So there's no difference. They are finding the same challenges and problems. But it requires some reimagining to find a way that is alive at this point in time, but may not be a structure in the education system. And one of those is, how do we get parents involved? It's always a question, particularly if there is a school that with high Pacific population, and yet historically it's very hard to get buy-in from parents to come and support. And so it was through those challenges that sometimes the answer is right there. And so it requires reimagining how you look at it, and then having brave leadership that can see step change to help pathway and improve the, I guess, the achievement for not just Indigenous students or Tokelau students, but for all students, all New Zealand students.
That's absolutely true, Zechariah. And when you've talked about there the difficulty of getting parents to engage, and I've just been talking with a principal of a school, and he talked about the difficulties there of getting people to engage, and I've heard that many times over the years. And yet when they do start talking outside of the formal conversations that are your normal structures, when you do start having those conversations off to the side, it's like there's no relevance, there's no space, there's school is not relevant, the systems that are in place are not relevant to the families, to what's going on in their lives. And so how do you break down those barriers and start creating spaces, creating new ways of having those conversations in order to learn about what is important for these families and what is important for these students.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Mm.
And I think what you've have touched on, that Indigenous have a view of holistic approach to well-being. And that's an area that's probably been not well contained or looked at over a number of years. And I feel that there is a reaction rather than a response. A reaction, so we see a number of breakfast clubs going. I only hope it's sustainable. But what that demonstrates is the ability now to see the child in a holistic manner. Whereas when I went through my schooling, I was a child at a school. My parents would come to the parents' evening and help where they possibly can during the fundraising of galas. And I think that generation back in the 60s and the 70s, many of them with no formal education, no English was a second language, but what they brought was life principles that were so important for them. Do not miss your class. Show respect to your teacher. Show respect to your fellow students in respect of what color or what part of the streets we lived in. Never be late for school. Always be honest to yourself and honest to others. And so while our parents did not have formal qualification that was recognized, They gave me, my family, and in our community, those principles that were not just soft skills, but they were life skills.
Zechariah, what you've just said is so true. And your family, your parents have given you the amazing principles to live life by. And that's one of the questions. They've given a huge amount of trust in the education system and hoping that by handing you over in a way to the education system, if you did those things, that you would be given the skills and the knowledge and so on from that education system that would help you with your life. What I'm seeing now and talking with so many people is that knowledge was based in a different culture with a different set of values, and that it was in many ways disjointed from life. And so this is some of the questions that are coming up now is who defines success? What is it that are the conversations? What is the content that we now need within our education system that will help all students to be able to succeed in their space, within their culture, within their life, rather than saying, this is what you need to know because this is what this culture values.
That term success is so common. How do you measure, how do you define success? I guess when I went through the school system, success was defined by my parents that I would walk out Poro College with UE entrance or UE to go to university. And for them, even achieving school C was a proud moment because there was no school C achievement in my mum's generation, let alone my father. And so any one of my siblings that got to that level was groundbreaking for our family. And so for families, success could be defined by not what the education system had at my time at Poro College. If we were to have a conversation with Poro College in 2020, that would totally be a different conversation in terms of how they define success. What we may have is success is defined by having that child of Tokelauan descent staying at school by choice. That in itself is a success. And if that child chose to stay, even with all its challenges, even if a family in the event lost jobs during COVID lockdown from 2 income to 1, and the onus is on the child who could be the oldest to look for part-time work to support that family, to stay for 6 months and manage the well-being of their family as a child, a success in its own right for that family. And I think that if we can have a meaningful understanding in a way that forges and navigates some solutions that what the family design and want, what I want, not what the school wants. Yet this is not a criticism to any school. We understand it's the education system in New Zealand. The responsibility is to ensure quality of education for all New Zealanders. But in that cycle, if that cycle in the 70s is still framed almost 50 years, that is still a one-fit-all purpose, ain't gonna work. It's not working. It will never work. The foundational principles that are non-negotiable can still remain. But how you deliver that in conjunction to outside the core of the education system, in partnership, in collaboration, in activation with those that want to see that family define their success, has a bigger impact than putting resources in a system that is not working for that child.
And that's the position that you're in right now, isn't it, Zechariah? Because you're working alongside the school system. You're working with communities to be able to work with technology, encourage students to engage in those STEM subjects in order to be able to nurture your own culture, sustain culture, sustain that understanding, and yeah, tell me about what you're doing.
The challenges in Aotearoa, Wellington, is no difference to the challenges in South Auckland or in Christchurch or Oamaru, Horowhenua, different parts of New Zealand where there is a acceleration of Pacific communities. In fact, it's no different in terms of our colleagues, the people of this land, Māori. The challenge is, how do we incorporate cultural knowledge or capital, cultural capital in the school system? And so when you have an intergeneration framework, the elders hold the knowledge, but they have stewardship of the knowledge. And during that journey of a child to a young person, to young couples, to families, they have a responsibility to ensure that college knowledge, cultural knowledge and practice is retained. The principle of ensuring the well-being of the family and the community is maintained. And so they have stewardship responsibility to ensure that they play their part. And so when we think of schools that have government reports that have come out to say, what is the number one for Pacific and Māori students in the school system? What came out for Pacific in a recent report in 2019 that was commissioned by the Ministry of Education. At the time, the Associate Minister, Jenny Salesa, together with the Ministry of Pacific People, commissioned this research just to gauge what was important for students across New Zealand and their families. So they had talanoas or community engagement up and down the country. The number one that came through was teachers saying the student's family name correctly. It talks about their identity and who they are. The Ministry of Pacific Affairs 2 years ago launched a Pacific Aotearoa vision of what the future will look like. In it, the number one that young people said is their cultural identity of who they are was the number one. Able to speak as we have more New Zealand born students. And so when it talked about teachers not pronouncing their name, which may seem very small or insignificant, it's actually significant. In fact, if I use my story, my name is Zechariah. In my Tokalauan culture, is known as Hakalia. When I discovered that that was my birth name, yet during my kindergarten and primary, intermediate, and college, and then working, I was not called that name. I actually was called Fred. And the reason I was called Fred was because, if you can recall, in the late 60s, early 70s, try to pronounce Hakalia Reuelu. And so I was given a default name, Fred. And to this day, many of my peers that I've grown up still call me Fred, which I don't have a problem with. But when I just discovered that in my late age, almost 12 years ago, that my birth name was Aotearoa, translated Zechariah, I reclaimed that because that's who I am. That's who my parents called and prayed for a name. It has history. Pacific names have history and connection to the land, to genealogy and those that have passed away. So there is so much richness in the name of a person. And so when they cannot pronounce that, you can imagine how some students or many students felt. When I discovered my true name, not my given name by someone who could not pronounce my name, there was a sense of freedom for me. When I actually asked, where did Fred come from? In those days, we didn't have a TV, but our neighbors did, who were beautiful New Zealand family that embraced us and we embraced them. And we watched their TV from the side window from outside. And there was this New Zealand farmer who had gumboots and a black singlet. For those that have grown up in that generation, that is an icon, New Zealand icon, Fred Dag. And so while I smile, I also recognize that it happened, but it doesn't define me.
Thank you for sharing that, Hakalia. I wish I had known your Tokoloan name.
I share in this context.
Mm. And that's the thing, isn't it? Is that there's so much that we don't know about the people that are in front of us in our classes, in both the other students around, the other teachers around. We don't know what is behind each of them. And the language that we use at home, the experiences that we've had, the culture that we've grown up with, it's almost like you get into school and that's no longer valued because this is the content that you need to learn and it's separate in so many ways. When you were talking before about working alongside the communities and the content of the education system, I got a very strong picture of that. You're wanting almost the students to be going to school in order to be able to get the knowledge that they need for their communities, to be able to continue growing the communities, as opposed to going to school and it's separate from the community and this is what they need to learn. It's almost like a walking in two worlds thing, that it would be much more helpful if this is what the community is doing and this is how they're growing and this is the information and the knowledge that they need in order to be able to do that even more effectively.
That's a very good question. I'm reflecting on what that question is in terms of a child or student navigating both worlds. In Tokoloan culture, we have men who are expert fishermen. Tautai is what they are titled. You earn that right. It's given to you, it's bestowed to you. These who understand the environment, the color of the ocean, the position where he then guides the fleet. And he, in one certain ceremony, when they arrive in an area where there are birds feeding, he is the one that actually does the first action. Anyone that does that before him breaks sort of good luck. So he acutely awares his role in guiding the well-being of the community, because his role is not just as a fisherman, but the impact we have in terms of a successful fishing outing to a non-fishing outing that is nothing to come back for the family. And so he's bestowed this important role. And it's a role that we see in terms of pastoring and mentoring our young people. And if those of our leaders that hold that knowledge and culture that are not in the school system, then there will always be that challenge for them. So those that have navigated both worlds, and some of the scale that's removed from your eyes to see those gaps, the ongoing trends, but see the opportunity, are the ones that can connect like a power plug. When you bring that connection, beautiful happens. And sometimes it's not what I imagine will happen. Because if I try to do that, it doesn't work. Part of the process is, how do I realign our elder here, our mother's weaving group over here, because they may not know mass formulas, but the weaving that they articulate and know so well have forms and patterns and formulas that can be actually translated in a way that for some of those students, it's like the pearl has dropped and go, wow, auntie, that makes a lot of sense. So you're bringing a cultural perspective in a broader sense of subjects that brings some meaningful engagement to our young people. So tokelau in Polynesian history, the definition in Polynesian history throughout the Pacific is the northern wind of Polynesia. And so our culture understands instinctively wind patterns. Do we have any of our tokelauans working in, what's the New Zealand organisation that gives us the news of our weather every 6 o'clock news?
Yeah, the meteorologists.
I don't think there's anyone there. But when research is showing that young people are crying for culture knowledge, and we have a few that are still remaining, how do we flip it that drives education outcomes in sectors that we are foreign in? That's the part we can play. And with technology, the role technology plays as an enabler is so untapped in terms of the opportunity, not just for tokelau, but for all New Zealanders. And so that has opened up a journey where we don't always have to be users. I'm a user, but you can be a user, but develop. And culture can be part of those enablers to have your culture knowledge transferred to the next generation. And while you're on that journey, you are an industry of high value. And all those learnings that you have taken from your school in conjunction with your community is now coming to pass for you. And when you are working in high value industry that pay the commercial rate for you, As research has shown, Pacific and Māori people give more back to their community. And when you don't have a lot to give, and so by giving that opportunity, you then have options in how you give back to replant those seeds for the next generation on that platform to go further. And so it is a good question. I just hope that I've answered that respectfully in a way that gives value to that question.
I really hope so too. And I really think that you have, Hakalia. There's so much in that whole question of culture, isn't there? And because culture is carried in a language. And I know from my own personal experience with my 3 children living in Japan that it is incredibly difficult to maintain your home language in a country where the dominant language is not your own. And so I know that that's one of the things you're doing with the students that you're working with, is helping them to learn and to treasure and to promote and to do all of the work that they're doing in the context of the Tokelauan language and culture as well, which I think is amazing.
United Nations, about 4 years ago, some years ago, I'm not too sure exactly, put a report of those Indigenous communities that in danger of their language passing away, and Tokelau was part of that narratives that they put out. So when I saw that, one of the things that caught me was me reflecting on my journey, because I grew up in my Tokelauan family, in my church environment, but I didn't really speak a lot of Tokelau. And now that I have young children, I guess there's been sort of that emptiness now that my father has passed away. And so what I've said in the last Tokelauan language back in October, never ever think you are less Tokelauan just because you cannot speak the language. Because whatever you have, and when you recognize what you have and bring it to the fore, that will go in meaningful ways like a ripple stone on a lake in terms of demonstrating and promoting your tokelau. And so what I'm reflecting on is that my children, my daughter has been part of a program where we work with an education provider in the STEM industry, OMG Tech, wonderful organization. And we partnered with them to look over how we can create a language app in conjunction with our young people in school, focusing on tokelau to start with, and more importantly, with our cultural experts. And so we co-designed it all together, because the alternative, we could have got a Tokelauan language app and contracted to a company, gave them content, put it up on the web, but I don't think it will have the impact than the journey we're going through. That may take time and may have a lot of learning and make mistakes, and may not have a greater buy-in, because anything new, but you've got to remain persistent, have faith, believe that those steps forward will have some impact before or after my time. And so over the last 3 years in this journey with OMG, we've seen increased numbers of Tokelauans in our community pick up STEM, improve their maths. We've seen students move into higher education, looking at computer science as a degree. We have had our elders and our mothers who are part of the cultural expert, providing the content, framing together the app to have a better understanding than being a user, that they actually develop to navigate the tools for the very user. Through this process, the students went through an online program with a facilitator and a number of supporters to ensure that they were learning the foundational of making an app. We now are in a position to actually reach beyond just Aotearoa. And when we ran this program, we had a number of, we piloted this year, we had a number of students in Palmerston North. The reality is when you go online, there's no borders, there's no boundaries. And we also face the reality in Tokelau as part of New Zealand territory. Most of our Pacific countries and neighbours, the education system has had many ups and downs and challenges in terms of quality. And so Tokelau is no different. But with technology, we may possibly have a program where instead of Foreign Affairs sending in consultants, we're sending our students, may be the educators in those countries that are hard to reach by physical, but through technology, there are outcomes such as language, STEM, well-being. And one part is cultural identity. For many of our students in New Zealand, almost 90% are New Zealand born, never been to Tokelau. Almost a high percent of Tokelau students in Tokelau have never done any programs. And how do we merge that together, still with educational providers that are brave enough to be innovative, to look outside the square, because this is a new dawn day. We're actually going to the next 10 years in 2021. What happened in 2010 may actually be absolutely no longer applicable as we move forward in the new generation. And so the term defined as teachers, while I still believe that that is a role important in our education system, that defining what an educator could be is open. And so it's opening up wonderful opportunities for those brave to look outside the status quo, to see something that they possibly don't fully understand. This is the beauty. We don't know sometimes what tomorrow looks like, and so we don't want to take that step. But when you take it with another person that has important set of skills and expertise that I don't have, and we forge together knowing that we got each other's back, I believe that is a good thing moving forward.
Mm. You're absolutely right, Hakalia, and thank you for sharing that, because so many of the other speakers that we've got as well are talking about that vision. What are they wanting to create? Not looking at the past, but going forward from here. And I love how you've been able to describe, and the pride in your face and the pride in your whole body as you're talking about what you're seeing as a result of the programs that you're working with, and the pride that you're seeing in your students as well. The children, the students that you're working with, as they know more and more and more about their own culture, their language, and they're seeing that useful in the context of what they're doing is absolutely amazing. And I love how it's spreading from Aotearoa into Palmerston North. And I can see the possibilities being endless, not only in that Tokelauan culture, but in many of those other Indigenous cultures as well. Really, really empowering stuff. So thank you so much for sharing that journey with us. You've given us 9 really useful questions, which I think are really helpful for helping people to reflect on where they're at in their lives. And I'm just going to quickly go through those ones because they're really helpful to be able to reflect on, aren't they? Are you living a meaningful life? How will your life be different in a year? What nice thing can you do for someone else today? How much do you worry about what other people think? What are you doing to invest in your relationships? What do you do for fun? What inspires you the most? What do you think are the 5 most beautiful things in the world? And what do you want your final words to be? And I think that those 9 questions are a really good starting place for every single person to be able to come back to regularly, to be able to just reset in terms of what's important in their lives. And is what's happening around them relevant? What do they need to change in order to be able to go forward into this future vision that you've talked about through this as well? So with that, what do you want your final words to be?
For all those that are listening to my audible voice, 2021 has just started. In life, you will hear a lot of voices, a lot of sounds. And one thing I've learned in the very short time that I've been in this world is that you can hear a lot of noises that sometimes clouds your thinking and derail some of the things that are close to your heart, that is always prompting you in your mind and in your wairua, which is your spirit. Where you hear the voice that affirms who you are and what you want to do and what you want to become and where you want to be. And you hear that voice that actually says, I believe in you. And so as 2021 starts, decisions that and the expectation that you had when you came on this and why you chose to listen to me, I do pray and hope that there could be some pearls, some words that fashioned and prompted you, or I like to think it's activated you in a path that you probably were looking for when you came into this workshop. And so if you go away from this kōrero or talanoa and tokalau, it's this talk. And as I said earlier, tokalau in the history of Polynesia is the northern wind of Pacific. And I pray that my voice is like the wind that is guiding you to where you want to be. So thank you for tuning in and giving up time to listen to this. And tokalau, I like to close and say, haka manuia, haka he dai lava, which thank you and prosper journey to you and your family. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hakalia. That's really fantastic for sharing that today. Wow. What a privilege it's been to listen to the story that we've heard here, the questioning that there is about identity, around the relevance, around how we can make our schools, our education system relevant to every single person that's in there, so that it can be of benefit to what they're needing in their lives, in their communities, and their futures. And I think that there's a huge amount that we can learn by learning from each other, learning about what is behind the person, what is, where are they coming from, what are their values, and what does success look like for them. So it's an ongoing journey in life, and I wish you all the best with it. Thank you.